Good morning. My name is Gretchen Musicant, and I am a member of the Social Justice Ministry team, and we are the ones that coordinate and bring to you the social justice forums. Every year we have a theme, and this year's theme for the program year was Diving Deeper Together So All Will Flourish. Through the forums, we are learning about longstanding needs and becoming more prepared to support the flourishing of all members of our community. Today, we welcome Adair Mosely, President and CEO of Pillsbury United Communities. Pillsbury United Communities' vision is for thriving communities where every person has personal, social, and economic power. Adair is a passionate change maker and relentless strategic innovator. He seeks radical, inclusive solutions to the community's most urgent needs, which are co-created with people most affected. His presentation today is titled Strike at the Root. He sums it up this way: in a moment of such pervasive inequities, we are presented with an opportunity to think disruptively about our collective future. This morning, Adair will share how Pillsbury United Communities is co-creating enduring change towards a just society and what it will take for us to meet this moment with a transformative impact. Just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. For those that are attending in person here, in the Mizell room, raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you so that when you have a comment or a question, not only will people in the room be able to hear you, but people online will also be able to hear you. And for those of you attending live stream, please submit your comments or questions in the live stream chat, and we'll monitor that and raise your questions and comments on your behalf. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Adair. Welcome.
Good morning. I'm going to just take a sip of this now. What, Gretchen, I think you may have grabbed my notes.
Oh, well.
Yep, you did. Thank you. Well, good morning. So great and pleased and honored to be with you all this morning, and thank you to the team, both Gretchen and Phil and Pastor Alana, and our wonderful technology back there for having me. Before I jump in and talk a little bit about the presentation and the work at Pillsbury United Communities, I do want to spend this morning setting a little bit of context. Most of this are things in which you all are very familiar with. Certainly, it's been more apparent over the past few years as with the things that we've dealt with in our direct community here. While I'm fortunate to lead an organization that's on the front lines of fighting for racial, social, and economic justice, but my heart is compelled to talk about the metastasizing of a cancer that stares us down. The consequences of not surgically addressing the dark underbelly of America's existence is corrosive for everyone. Extreme inequality corrupts politics, hinders economic growth, and stifles social mobility. It squanders talent, thwarts potential, and undermines the foundations of society. This morning, I tend to speak right to the heart of the matter. While we generally deploy individuals that have been on the front lines of social justice like Dr. King, words as platitudes, we must not forget that they called us to be antagonists of injustice, disruptors, and freedom fighters. Again, data that will be very prevalent to you all, but let me share. The median black family income is roughly $38,000 a year, which is less than half of the median white family income. And the black poverty rate in the Twin Cities was at almost 26%, which is over 4 times the white poverty rate of 5%. While about 3/4 of white families in the Twin Cities own their home, only about 1/4 of black families do. In 2019, the incarceration of blacks in the Twin Cities was 11 times that of whites, the nation's worst education achievement gaps between black and whites, right here in our own backyard. This morning, I tend to speak to the heart of the matter. An attack on the pillars of democracy ensues. Limited absentee ballot drops, limited periods for early voting, racialized gerrymandering. While these restrictions are not so draconian as the 60s, where we saw poll tax, intimidation, and literacy tests, make no mistake, they demoralize a free and democratic society. This morning, I want to speak to the heart of the matter. George Floyd, Elijah McClain, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others, names who cried for their mothers, mama, mama, mama. Names who in their last breaths wanted people to see their humanity, their existence. These are not names, statistics, and social economic injustices of the 60s. This is the reality in 2022. So my question this morning is, what are you doing about it? Again, I want to speak to the heart of the matter. We've come so far, but we have so far to go. Justice has continued to be delayed for blacks across this country, a book of never-ending chapters of systemic and institutional racism that has brought us sustained pain and trauma. But I'm reminded of Mahalia Jackson's riveting performance at the March on Washington for Freedoms and Jobs, where she sang How I Got Over. This has been the tale of blacks for centuries, a relentless pursuit to actualize freedom despite the stubborn barriers that stand in the way. And I stand in awe of what we've had to carry. Complacency, apathy, or silence are vices. This movement requires virtuous action, courage, solidarity, and will. And so no matter how you in this room or those that are listening have arrived at this critical juncture, whether you've spent a lifetime on the front lines of social justice or you're just beginning to understand the depths of systemic injustices, we are here together. And where we go from here matters. King's words, if I will, which is why it's important for this bold and provocative title of Strike at the Root, because it compelled us to move beyond charity, to truly think about the evolution of the heart and mind, the eradication of oppressive systems and policies, and to be unapologetic about justice for all. As Reverend Barber says, to preach like Dr. King is to say and do. Somebody is hurting and we won't be silent anymore. This is a true beloved community. God sent Jeremiah to deliver a message to the king for him. He said, "Go down to the palace of the king of Judah and proclaim this message. This is what the Lord says. Do what is just and right. Rescue from the hand of the oppressor the one who has been robbed. Do no wrong or violence to the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. And do not shed innocent blood in this place. But if you do not obey these commands, declares the Lord, I swear by myself that this palace will become a ruin." Our collective voice must be heard. I believe this is our time. And although some days this work is heavy, every day I rise with a sense of hope and optimism. We must remain determined, disciplined, and hopeful. And I hope that we can transform a place that is centered with communities' desires for themselves and their families, self-actualized and self-determined. This movement needs a groundswell of change agents that seeks a more balanced and harmonious relationship with our values, our politics, and systems. Let me pause there and talk a little bit about how we're actually moving into action at Pillsbury United Communities. Gretchen did a wonderful job of setting who we are as an agency, but let me just reiterate that this is about solidarity. This is about co-creation towards that just society, and it's undergirded by a vision that every person has personal, social, and economic power, and there will be no rest until that is achieved. Our work is organized across 3 particular areas: people, place, prosperity, and now we've actually added a 4th P, which is policy, as a united system of change. And so these things come together while some days quite chaotic, but it is really a conglomeration of programs, activities, neighborhood centers, social enterprises that are all coming together to create this more just and equitable society, particularly for the residents here in the Twin Cities. While our work expands the entire Minneapolis city, and we've certainly actually are having more impact beyond our borders to a more regional approach, today I'm going to center a lot of the innovative efforts that have been coming particularly with our work in North Minneapolis. One of the things that I want to share with you all this morning is the work of justice-built communities. Following the murder of George Floyd, many asked our organization what were we going to do in terms of responding to that moment. And while we supported a lot of activists and those that were abolitionists for different inequitable systems, we recognized that we wanted to continue to lift that up and give that space, but there was a different role for an institution that is over 140 years. And so immediately following that, we stood up a community development corporation called Justice Built Communities. And this is an engine of economic justice for our region. Let me paint a picture for you why we needed to stand this enterprise up. If you look at the 2 data points here, in a 5-year period from 2015 to 2020, North Loop has seen $1.2 billion in real estate activity. During that same time frame, North Minneapolis has only seen $13 million. And if any of you can think about the last decade of how much the North Loop area has transformed, from hotels to new apartment buildings to thriving businesses, restaurants. I always say that the irony here is that Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, to me, always was in North Minneapolis, and today is in the neighborhood of North Loop. And the gentrification and the displacement that continues to happen in the more immediate area. But more importantly, by the spatial kind of Plymouth Avenue, that divide is over $1 billion delta. This is systemic. But it's been a legacy of choices, a century of inequities, from redlining to the interstate construction, what we're talking about in the Rondo neighborhood, to exclusionary lending, concentrated poverty, and more today of what we're seeing around gentrification and the displacement of people who, again, are just simply trying to make a way out of no way. And if you drive down West Broadway, this is the reality today. That disinvestment. I'll get back to the building on the bottom. But imagine if this is your context of your community every single day when you walk out your doors, and what it does to you, what it says and what it communicates about place. And that the narratives that are often shaped about place. I always like to say the bottom picture was heavily damaged during the civil unrest and was burned. But the top picture has sat like that for the past 2 decades, directly across the street from each other. So Justice-Built Communities was meant to be about new businesses, job creation, neighborhood revitalization, generational wealth building, but back to that policy, coupling it with anti-displacement policies. And so today, Justice-Built Communities is on a plan to bring equitable economic development, small businesses, thinking about Black and brown entrepreneurship, the labor, the capital, all of those things, weaving it together to build thriving corridors. And we're already activating. That O'Reilly site that we talked about, we purchased that, one of our first acquisitions, as part of, because you can't talk about the revitalization of place if you don't actually own the land. And so one of the strategies that we've been deploying as an organization is to be able to think about dilapidated, underinvested properties across. Now, while today we're starting in North Minneapolis, Justice-Built Communities will be an entity that we can pick up and frankly move to any neighborhood we're asked to lead economic transformation. And so we've already, so if you actually drive by today, you won't see the O'Reilly site there because we've demoed it. And it was important to me to do that immediately. And I said, I don't care if it's just green grass. We're going to make sure the grass every day is pretty. And then as part of the other acquisition, don't have a photo of it, but directly kitty corner from that site was a car wash that was the undesirable activity happening in a community, very little car washing happening. And so we've been actually able to acquire that piece of land as well. And we have some bold and innovative plans to bring thriving businesses to the corridor. We're thinking about things that will promote entrepreneurship, especially in the fintech space, around financial technology. If any of you did any online banking on your phones this morning or sent cash to grandchild or child with any of the tools like Zelle, those are the types of innovation that we can support right here in our own backyard, given the critical mass of the financial institutions that we have. But thinking about how Black and brown entrepreneurs can benefit from that system and to be able to grow wealth, grow businesses, create jobs right here in our own community. This is also important along this corridor because if you haven't heard, the Blue Line, the extension of the Blue Line will go right down Broadway. And so it was important for us to think about getting speculative land off the market, because if we don't, then investors will come in, buy the land, drive cost up, that ultimately results in displacement of people in community. And so I will be looking forward to coming back here and sharing the work that we're doing out around economic revitalization in North Minneapolis. One of the other things that you may have heard a few weeks ago, again, it's not, you all know this, that North Minneapolis and frankly our entire city is dealing with a spate of acute violence. And then I think we have to ask ourselves why, right? It is because we have not made the investments in our young people in the ways. It is because they encounter a system every day where only roughly 30% are graduating Black students in a district. It is because they don't see hope. they don't see a future beyond 94 and West Broadway. And so earlier this year, a sophomore at North High was murdered, Deshaun Hill, while out on a walk with the rest of his class. And I was in London and called a few colleagues and said, we have to do something to restore hope. And all students across our country, frankly, have felt the disruption around their education with COVID. But there's something that, and not just in North Minneapolis, but urban core, that students walk a different walk, and another barrier that is put in front of them. And so it came to us to say, how do we inspire an entire class? And so calling a few philanthropic friends of ours, within 45 days, we were able to raise $1 million to give each graduating senior at North High a $10,000 scholarship towards their education future. And this was important, and so these are photos from that event. And this was important because it was to look at all of those students in that class, roughly 100 that are graduating this year, to say you're important, we value you, we see you. You don't have to be defined by the circumstances in which you're experiencing. You can overcome the obstacles. But sometimes we just need people who look us in the eyes and tell us that. And say, I believe you and I see you. The other thing that was really important about this is that oftentimes scholarships go to the brightest. And so we forget about those that will fall through the cracks because we're not making investments in them. And then they ultimately result to being on Broadway and Lindale every day. We said without conditions, every student in here gets it. You graduate, you get it. And so I don't care if you go to a 2-year college. I don't care if you're wanting to take a boot camp around coding, or you want to do music production, whatever it is. We want to say we believe in you, we see you. And so this is them actually holding up a letter in here that details, not the actual check. And so part of the work that we're doing now is that each student, the up to $10,000, but we've allocated $10,000 per student. The money will go directly to the educational institution once they've declared. We're also giving them a year to decide. If you don't have a plan right now, the money won't go away. I've received messages from parents who said, I was sitting at the kitchen table figuring out what we were going to do. I've received, it gives me hope that our students and young people still have agency. Who receive letters and emails from a few students who said, thank you for seeing us. And I've even received messages of students who saying, I left North High in my sophomore year. Can I get it? But, what it communicates is that we have to think about solutions at the scale of the challenge. And how do we do things like this over and over and over again? And that's the way in which we are going to eradicate these systemic inequities. The other work that you all know, and I believe I've shared this here at this platform, is that we continue to disrupt the food systems work, particularly in North Minneapolis, but frankly across our city. This is North Market, which is approaching its 5th anniversary here in December. What this has done for the 44th Avenue part of North Minneapolis is just simply remarkable. 5 years ago, it was, abandoned. The Hennepin County was making some investments in a library, but quite dilapidated. This building was boarded up. And the reactivation that's happened along 44th Avenue with the investments from the county but Houston White has opened a wonderful coffee shop and barber shop right on the corner, and it's just a thriving business. And everybody continues to say it's because we put this critical infrastructure in community that has now served as a catalyst for revitalization. And while the premise of it is certainly thinking about fresh food access, I think it did something more for the North Minneapolis community. It restored dignity. And how undignified it was that you had to get on a bus and travel 3 miles in either direction to be able to access food. And how undignified it is that you're doing your grocery shopping at a convenience store where there's over 30 in North Minneapolis, a few coupled on the same block or within a few blocks of each other. One of the highlights of this story is through some generous support of one of our funders, General Mills. We're able every Wednesday to offer half off produce. And on our social media page, parents saying, North Market has made it affordable for us to eat healthy. And people that are, we have 2 senior high-rises, one right across the tracks and then one immediately behind the building. But seniors are saving their SNAP, their MSA dollars, and bringing them over so that they can either get discounts on the senior days or get produce. And so this is also, and I'm excited that we're bringing activity back after being shut down for almost 2 months around our community space, where we have cooking classes, food demonstrations, Zumba. It is an absolutely remarkable view to see Val Turner and Shay Stanifer, coaches that have 50 black women in the parking lot doing Afro beats and Zumba, thinking about their health. And so how this just continues to serve so many entrepreneurs. One of the great success stories of this is that we have roughly 25 black and brown entrepreneurs, who could not get into a Cub or a Hy-Vee, and but are light manufacturing their products, and we gave them space in this store, and roughly $200,000 in sales returned to them last year. And one of the best success stories is Latunji Abram, who owns Latunji's Palette, which she makes peach cobbler and other desserts. Came into our store in North Market, was her first store. And now she's in all the Lunds and Byerlys. And she just opened up a storefront at 14th and Park yesterday. And so I'm just so heartened that this enterprise is doing more than just, the access piece, but is truly driving wealth creation and people being able to live out their dreams, especially in the food enterprise space. The other great thing about it, if you drive up there, on our site is a freight farm. And this container is a freight, but it's hydroponic farming. And it's equivalent to about 1.5 acres of growing space. And so this, it grows basil, lettuce, iceberg lettuce, largely herbs, greens. And we're teaching youth kind of around hydroponic farming. So we have a rotation of youth that come in and work with Micah, who's pictured here. And those youth and some of our staff have created a brand. So we're selling the product out of here. It's called Kindness, which is one of our values as an organization. And so you see Thai basil, the green leaf lettuce that is being sold back into North Market. And then we're also selling to a few co-ops. And so just thinking about teaching young people not only around how to grow, but also the entrepreneurship piece to it as well. So quite a bit of innovation that is happening in our immediate community in North Minneapolis, but today I only focused on North. I could take you south and talk about our work in arts and culture at Pillsbury House and Theater on 35th in Chicago as they ramp back up their production season, or the work we're thinking about bringing more bio-innovation to the Cedar Riverside community, which is largely East African. Lots of enterprising that's happening across our organization. But the things in which I'm describing here is striking at that root, moving beyond charity to transformative impact. Don't get me wrong, both are needed. Both will be needed. We will be able to meet the needs, the social needs of our community. But if we only stay there, those are temporary solves at best. And so we have to be in this moment. If we do not want to be talking about this, our kids and our grandkids to be talking about this, then we have to strike at the root. And so I believe, again, this is our time. And I'm willing and have and will continue to give my all to curing the pervasive pandemic that continues to erode at humanity, racism, and white supremacy. So whether you call in, sit in, march in protest, or exert your influence from a place of economic or social power, every day your feet hits the ground is a fight for justice. Our collective future depends on just systems that work for everyone, rooted in structural and policy changes that create the type of social and economic justice we know everyone deserves. True emancipation, despite zip code or race. This is hope, this is change, this is our way forward. Lastly, it is not lost upon me that as I reflect and I think about the shoulders, those shoulders who I stand on, were not old when they led the movement. People like Dr. King, who was 39 at the time of his death. And so, I'm 39. And I want to be a vessel. I want to be of use. And when I get to the end of the journey, whether it's career or otherwise, I want my hands to be filthy from doing the work. I believe better days are upon us. But most importantly, we have to have the courage to fight for them. So happy to take any questions around the work that was described this morning, but I appreciate your attention, and I'm deeply honored to be able to share our work with you. Just in case anybody wants to see mine.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for all that Pillsbury United is doing. It's great. This is Youth Sunday at Westminster. Yeah. The youth are running the service this morning. Yeah. They're doing the music. They're doing the preaching. So your comments on youth engagement are good. I'd like you to speak a little bit more about ways our youth could get involved.
Yeah. I think across the city, we need to be standing up more innovation for our young people, more entrepreneurial learning, getting them into spaces that I think build the type of kinship. I often describe, I think one of the things that we've done wrong in our narrative and storytelling is that we've made the types of programs in which I'm describing and centering on only kind of Black or Latino youth, recognizing that all youth need these types of experiences in our community, and we need to be making the investments in them. And so I think that goes to, whether there are youth that are looking to do tutoring, a wealth of opportunities that can do that, participating in any of the programs, so are just some more immediate ways that I think about engagement. Yeah.
Thank you, Adair. It also seems, in answer to that question, modeling the kind of partnership that we want to see, the the togetherness, the learning from each other, I think would be really beautiful.
Absolutely.
Is there anything online of
Not
note?
quite yet.
Not
I've invited
quite.
questions or comments.
All right. Well, the social justice ministry team had a retreat yesterday planning our year going forward, and really, I'm not remembering the whole word of our phrase, but really talking about the notion of investing and investing in each other's well-being and investing, certainly money is part of investing, but also this going to the root. And so really your comments are so connected to what we were talking about yesterday, so without you knowing, so thank you.
That's affirming.
So are there other thoughts or comments people would like to share? Oh, I see some, okay, and Elena will.
Thank you so much. That was so informative and so inspiring.
Good.
I know that organizations that are doing innovative work, it's a constant cycle of learning, adapting, learning again. So I'd just love to hear a little bit about your learning process as an organization. Maybe you could talk a little about something you did early on, and then you kind of figured out what worked, what didn't, and then your next project was inspired by what you learned from that first project. So I just love to hear about that learning trajectory.
You know, this is funny because I was just talking with my predecessor and did a podcast with Shonda Smith Baker at the Minneapolis Foundation, Conversations with Shonda, who I know have been here many times. And one of the things I shared with her is that, I inherited an organization that had a DNA of just kind of both entrepreneurialism, innovating, enterprising. And I think at this moment we recognize that it's something you don't mess with. And even as we think about succession in the organization, we've been very clear, don't mess with that, because that's the thing that which makes Pillsbury great. But more explicitly, the learning process came out of, there's a couple tangible tools in which we use as an organization. Human-centered design thinking is kind of our process. I was, prior to becoming the CEO, Chief Innovation Officer, and so led the development of the grocery store. And we codified that process by bringing it in. But even before that, we took some things actually from our theater, who had started to embrace this notion of something very adjacent to human-centered design, but this kind of creative culture practice that said tension is good. And so we sit in the space of sometimes juxtaposing views, the tension, not making it personal, but saying, let's work through that. That actually is the catalyst for a lot of great ideas. What is oftentimes, when I talk to people about innovation and how do you develop the next thing, automatically people go, if I had the money. And we go, no, it's mindset. And it is breaking the traditional models of how we think about human services and to those kind of mental models, disrupting them and saying that it's not linear. Community is not linear, right? People actually don't want to be case managed. And so if we actually listen with a deep sense of humility around their needs, they will be able to communicate. And I will tell you, it took me, a few years to get that. And now it's the thing I can't turn off. That everything I look at is through a lens of disruption and how might we do it and how do we take leaps. And so I challenge the folks that are around me in our organization that incrementalism is not the way, that we are in a moment that we need to take leaps around especially the things in which we're talking about. Otherwise, we won't achieve it, which is why, Gretchen and I were talking about this earlier, which is why we say a whole class gets it, right? Not 3 students, incrementalism. Whole class gets a scholarship. That's a leap. And the more we can take that is actually the type of mindset that we need to be in this moment. And I know there may be another question. The other thing is not quite to your question, but I think is important because we are seeing a historic budget surplus. And I tell people this number outside of our state, and they cannot believe what, almost $10 billion means. And I've been dissatisfied with the solutions that are coming to the table because we actually have a moment to take leaps around so many things that are holding people back, and not just an urban issue, statewide issues, the disinvestment in education, the housing crisis, affordability. And so if we were to double down and actually say we're going to strike at the root around these systems, we're going to incentivize innovation around, I was talking to other innovators in Spain, saying this is a moment that we could be incentivizing disruption around so many of the systems that are broken in this system, yet we're defaulting to incrementalism. And so how do you think about solutions at the scale of the challenge?
So thank you, Adair. There's a couple questions online, and one of them really picks up on this notion of that you were just talking about at the legislature, the notion of we need disruption, but we have folks who don't seem ready or attuned to that, or perhaps they're fearful. And I'm not ascribing that to the questioner at all, but the person is not from the Twin Cities. And I asks, do you see anything that those of us in the hinterlands, 50 miles away, may become more aware and involved in social justice and food fairness issues? So to me, that's the specific question, but also this other question of how do we get that feeling of these times are really a calling to do more than we're used to doing.
I think one of the narrative is so important, and I didn't even mention, a part of our organization, we have a huge narrative, lots of narrative platforms. We produce the community newspaper, North News, for the North Side. We also have a radio station in South, KRSM, and then the theater being a narrative platform. So again, very enterprising as an organization. One of the things that I think we've done and I don't know how we bridge, as a person who grew up in my adolescent years in St. Charles, Minnesota, graduated out of Winona. I know greater Minnesota. Is that we don't talk about, we often divide that in our narrative, and we make it an us versus them, like the metro versus greater Minnesota, not recognizing. I often say that the rural white has more in common with the urban black than we describe. When we talk about things around food access, when we were building the store, I talked to folks in, Wilmer, Minnesota, small towns throughout our state where the mom and pop grocery store was closing. And now they're having to drive 30 miles into, Austin or Rochester to be able to get to the next grocery store. And so it wasn't just an urban issue. And so I do think that there's moments that we, in forums and platforms where we can actually have a discussion on that these are things that are happening across our entire metro. The other thing is getting away from the narrative that rural America or, greater, Minnesota in this context is only white. If you think about the I-90 corridor, right, that are from Albert Lee all the way over to actually Winona, that is getting browner and browner. St. Cloud, other parts of our state. And so these are issues that are affecting us all. And so I don't think we need to be as polarizing as part of that. And so I think where there's platforms where we can push our policymakers to stop driving the divide, I think we're all probably looking for some hope in politics, right? And I'm one to say that I get so disappointed on all the sides, right? Because it seems sensibility is just frankly out of the window. But I'm looking for the space that is developing the bold and courageous leaders, and they don't seem to be coming forward in the ways in which I would hope. Where we've seen it in this state, the Hubert H. Humphreys, and folks like that who just had such courageousness and led us through such dark times, and inspired and instilled hope in us. And I think it's hard to find that in today's politics.
Thank you, Adair. And I'm going to echo, I'm just going to have one more question, and then we'll get to you in the room. Carol Ann, who writes in and just thanks you for being with us, and then goes on to wonder if you have advice for us at Westminster in terms of the need for giving, the need for changing systems toward justice, and what you might ask of us today and now here at Westminster.
Yeah. While I certainly, I think the resources to fuel the social justice work is important to organizations, and ensuring that that they can be sustained, that the efforts can be sustained from a financial standpoint is important. The other thing that I think in this moment of largely a white, I'm assuming, congregation, that the examination of privilege, and I believe this is a church that I can lift up as one that has been in that deep examination. And what is also, that the circles in which, once you leave the doors, and that the narrative continues at the dinner tables, the social gatherings, that it's a constant conversation. And solidarity looks like, supporting things that may not be at the top of your agenda, but are important to the movement. And that means calling legislators and pushing for policies that will advance the type of equities that we're talking about. That means not, being complacent. That means everyone is political. The business has even had to become political over the past couple of years. There is no time, as I mentioned, for apathy. And I think what's important is that when people tell you they are hurting, you believe them. We don't make excuses for it. We don't try to justify it. We believe them. And which is hard for me to understand why that hasn't grasped on, because I go, if most people that you cared about, if they came to you and said that they were hurting, take for example your spouse, partner, you would work to try to, at least if you cared about them, to rectify it, to fix it, to understand. Yet we have population of people who are saying that there is a collective kind of hurt that is happening. And yet we justify it. And so that question is, here's what I want. I want people to be angry and so upset and make it so personal. Make this so personal that every day is a fight around the things that matter to our collective future. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's turn to a question here in the room.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Obviously, what you're trying to do is complex. It's
Yeah.
a given. But underneath a lot of the initiatives that you've described today is money. You need money.
Yes, ma'am.
what are the activities that Pillsbury undertakes to obtain money? Do you go after private money? Do you go after public money? Do you write grants? Just tell us a little bit about your money getting, because it's absolutely essential.
I love when people like you sit in the front row. No, so it takes an annual, quite the team to do an annual fundraising. Just a little bit of context. And we have a few funders who are in deep relationship, which means they're giving multi-year funding. But most of the funding cycles are on an annual basis. So every year we're going out to do a request, write, or propose, a lot of capacity to do that. So from that makeup, which is one of the things that's really important to understand, is, at least in our context, is that about 99% of my money is restricted. So people are giving to a specific cause. And what organizations actually need in a moment to be able to be responsive is unrestricted dollars. Most of those unrestricted dollars come through individual donations. Occasionally, you can get a foundation that will give you a general operating gift. But the more and more you can grow the capacity around individual giving and people who give it without conditions, but because they want to support the mission of the organization. So we get roughly 30% government, and that's at all levels, local and state and some federal pass-through dollars. Corporations, you know this, from corporations and foundations, we have a critical mass of, outside of New York, we may have the highest concentration per capita of foundations and corporations that are here in our own backyard. And then some of these enterprises produce earned income as part of it. And the area that we are trying to grow as an organization is in that individual giving. We've been heavily strong in the relationships with corporations and foundations, in the institutional givers, as we'd like to describe it. But today it is about, okay, who are the individuals that believe enough in the mission that want to support it from a general operating standpoint? And those are through some explicit asks or requests and hiring a director of individual investment.
Thank you, Adair. I think we have time for one more question. The notion of, and this is a lead up to the question.
Yeah.
So I often hear about concerns about gentrification, and your example for us of acquiring land along what will be a transit way in order to really foster the kinds of businesses that serve the community and don't rely on outsiders to think what should be there, was a beautiful example that helped me understand what exactly do we mean when we want to fight gentrification. So this question has to do online from one of our folks there is, when you talk about policy, can you give us some examples to kind of make that alive for us?
Absolutely. So just a little bit of context. In gentrification, depending on who you ask around the definition of the word, I often like to describe it as the erasure of both people and culture that have been in place. And that is oftentimes what comes in and happen, and it's people that, put some fancy name to a neighborhood, rebranding it. We definitely need socioeconomic diverse communities. Concentrated poverty does not work. And so that's important. I think the most important word here is displacement, actually. Because how do you build things, how do you revitalize a community that keeps those that have lived and labored there in place and to be the direct beneficiaries of the future development that is to happen? Policies, and which is why we're standing up policy alongside and working in parallel, are a few things. Not without getting too technical here. But for example, if you have a major transit way that in most places appreciates the value of the things that are around it because people want to live near transit. Asterisk. Some people are like, not in my backyard. But most people, like, the land value benefits from having access to transit. Well, one of the policies that we are perhaps how do you the land that is adjacent to that type of economic development, you actually petition to freeze property taxes in or around it. So you do a kind of a land value capture perhaps, and that benefit can go into other economic development. But you freeze that property tax right, because why that's important is because we know that that can be a driver of displacement. Because if you're renting, right, that's oftentimes carried over into, you know, rental rates, or if you're the homeowner and you see, you know, double-digit increases on your property taxes, it can become unaffordable. And so you can do that over a period of time. You can also think about, in particular areas, we're thinking about setting up policies around like a REIT, which is a real estate investment trust. And so you can have investments from, let's say, community actually own. You can do lots of creative policies and models where community owns land around, and so that that is being distributed back to community, the proceeds of any increase in value. One of the city, and this has been a policy that's been at the city level, but the right of return. So if a renter is displaced, that they have the first right to return is the type of policies. So we have a host of policies that we're pushing, quite an aggressive policy agenda that is going to be coupled with these types of investments that are coming to our communities.
Thank you so much for those wonderful examples and really inspiring ideas, and for all that you have shared with us today. And those of us in the room can thank you, and maybe online.
Thank you.
Throw up some little hand clapping. So next Sunday is the final Social Justice Forum before we break for the summer. And we'll take a look at some of the highlights of this year's forums and share our theme for the upcoming year, which I gave you a hint of, and have some discussion to help us shape the upcoming forums that really will allow us to take what we have learned this year and continue to be on our journey of learning and action. So thank you, Adair, and thank you all for being with us today.